podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on postqualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist research. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com. I'm Karin Murris, and this podcast is a different entry point into Chapter 3 of navigating the postqualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist terrain across disciplines. The chapter is called The Missing Peoples of Critical Posthumanism and New Materialism. I thought it might be helpful, more interesting even, to tell you a little bit about how the chapter was composed. So in many ways, it wasn't done deliberately, but in trying to get a major argument across, I noticed that I kept diffracting through different layers to the writing, different access points or entry points, if you like. So they're all entangled in such a way that if, for example, you watch the videos, it's not just the visual that's added to the words on the paper. It is sort of assumed that you have either read, for example, the transcripts in the chapter of the work in the classroom, for example, and then access the video of the work in the classroom, or vice versa, or at the same time, if that's possible. The videos are part of the argument and not merely there to illustrate. So the first embedded text in the chapter is the Posthuman Child Manifesto. It's co-created with editorial cartoonist Brandon Reynolds. Now, this chapter makes regular references to the animated cartoon and includes a link to a Google Doc with the academic text, but the text also stands on its own and can be skipped. So it's a geopolitical reading of theories of child and childhood, and it makes a passionate visual argument for a reconfiguration of colonizing notions of child and childhood. Now, what I realized now as I return to the chapter is that I wanted to affect the reader and give force to my argument through its multilayered structure, which is that children and their practice are not really taken seriously, a kind of ontoepistemic injustice. So the concept is a diffractive engagement with Miranda Fricker's powerful work on epistemic injustice, which I started in 2013 in a paper and then took up diffractively in my book, The Posthuman Child. So the key idea is that children are not listened to because of their very being, so onto of child, a kind of ageism, and it involves institutionalized generalizations about children informing unjustified stereotyping. Now, in epistemic injustice done on the basis of structural prejudices surrounding their ontological identity. So the diffractive coining of the two terms, always already entangled, indicates the fact that the shift to a relational ontology is at the very same time an epistemological shift. Knowing subjects are always already part of the world. Now, in this chapter, I exemplify ontoepistemic injustice through another layer, a QR code, and it's an engagement with Magaliso, who asks a so-called difficult question in Parliament, and the question is, why don't children have the vote? I don't really want to go into that now. I think it's a really powerful video and the analysis in the chapter. The questions really are there. Why is ageism so ingrained? And what are the material discursive practices that have brought institutionalized childism into existence? Now, a genealogical tracing of the history of ideas might help to understand institutionalized childism, and you can find this in the QR code in the chapter of the Posthuman Child Manifesto. But I've also concentrated on only these 6 figurations from a more recent inaugural called What is a Child? You can also find that on YouTube, but it's not in the chapter because it's only just come out. Child is equated with the uncivilized savage in need of cultivation, and the cultural nature, rational, irrational woman, and sophisticated primitive adult are the core binaries that structure prejudice and the colonizing relationships between humans and other animals. Now, I've already talked about the particular location of this chapter in terms of the book, the series, etc., but where am I in the research in this chapter located? Now, location and situatedness are often confused, as situatedness means local for some, and posthumanists have been accused of not being aware of their own location, thereby perpetuating racism and coloniality. Now, Karin Murris alerts us to how situatedness is often misunderstood to mean the local. Situatedness is more than location. She also writes that contextual is not a particularly apt term, and the notion of context connotes separability as a starting point. It presumes there is an object that exists apart from its environment or surroundings, and that this environmental context matters in some way. Now, context, of course, matters, but not in a sense that different elements are connected in a causal way, more in a tentacular, hera way, octopus kind of way. Now, like Vincent Desprez says in the context of animals, I don't want to speak about children in their absence and avoid on-behalfness. So I prefer to think with real children, either through recordings or in classroom settings, as I'm trying to do in this chapter. Let children's animistic practices do their own work. Animism in humans of all ages tends to be misunderstood as magical, pre-rational and mere fantasy, a form of thinking to be left behind in the process of growing up, maturation or civilization. Now, when you start tracing child as phenomenon in research or not as a discrete entity or zipped body in the world, the space-time entanglements are infinite and, to be honest, almost overwhelmingly so. My research that includes writing about Liam in this chapter is not about Liam, a bounded object or subject in the world, my youngest son, but Liam in inverted commas, a subject that is material and discursively constituted through space-time mattering. He's not a given, but constituted through relations that matter as a worlding practice. Liam and his passion for cars and how this interest in cars materialized him, in inverted comma, literally becoming a road sign at his sister's wedding in West Wales as he was directing the guests, arriving to the neighbouring paddock where they could park their car. The example features in my book, The Posthuman Child. Liam keeps appearing in my research writing, and very much so in this chapter. I was fascinated by Liam's philosophizing and, of course, often in conversation with his brothers and sister and the many animals we looked after and they looking after us. When he was about 5 years old, we wrote a story together and tried to get it published, but there was little interest, to be honest. I thought it was so different of anything you can find in children's literature, because the vast majority is one either written by adults, but also very much censored and aligned with a particular market, which is often sentimentalizing and romanticizing childhoods. But I think the story beautifully disrupts adult binary logic. So when about 13 years later I received an email from an Iranian visual artist with a request whether I had a story to illustrate, I jumped to the chance. His name is Kaveh Saifi, now renamed as Saif. Then the co-creation started, in close consultation with Liam, actually, who had already left home by then. It's not published as yet, by the way, the picture book, only this chapter. Of course, I would love it to be published, as the illustrator is so in tune with Liam's animism. So I would really like to invite you to watch the video clip that Liam created himself, and the analysis of it is on pages 79 and 80. But to be honest, I think rather than giving my interpretation, which is already written down, I think it would be really interesting to see what kind of work it does for you in your work and in your home life. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.